Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to WorksheetCloud and to your English lesson. My name is Mrs. Fauger. Remember, during the lesson, if you have any questions about today's lesson, you can email me at the email on the screen, grade7@worksheetcloud.com. So let's jump into our lesson today. We are going to be reading. I am going to be showing you some pictures along the way just to give you some visual. But I don't like to use too many pictures because I also want you to picture what you are reading in your own mind and not have me dictate it. So we're carrying on from chapter 10. Remember, we ended off, it was, "There you are, Grandpapa," she said. "I told you they put them in here. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful? Oh, can they be mine, Grandpapa? Please, can they be mine?" So the introduction of a new character, a little girl, and let's see where this leads us. Chapter 10. Remember, we've got Joey the horse that is obviously speaking. "If it is possible to be happy in the middle of a nightmare, then Topthorn and I were happy that summer. Every day we had to make the same hazardous journeys up to the front line, which in spite of almost continuous offences and counter-offences, moved only a matter of a few hundred yards in either direction. Hauling our ambulance cart of dying and wounded back from the trenches, we became a familiar sight along the pitted track. More than once we were cheered by marching soldiers as they passed us. Once, after we plodded on, too tired to be fearful, through a devastating barrage that straddled the road in front of us and behind us, one of the soldiers, with his tunic covered in blood and mud, came and stood by my head and threw his good arm around my neck and kissed me. 'Thank you, my friend,' he said. 'I never thought they would get us out of that hellhole. I found this yesterday and thought about keeping it for myself, but I know where it belongs.' And he reached up and hung a muddied ribbon around my neck. There was an iron cross dangling on the end of it. 'You'll have to share it with your friend,' he said. 'They tell me you're both English. I bet you are the first English in this war to win an iron cross. And the last, I should wonder.' The waiting wounded outside the hospital tent clapped and cheered us to the echo, bringing doctors, nurses, and patients running out of the tent to see what there could be to clap about in the midst of all this misery. They hung our iron cross on a nail outside our stable door, and on the rare, quiet days when the shelling stopped and we were not needed to make the journey up to the front, a few of the walking wounded would wander down from the hospital to the farmyard to visit us. I was puzzled by this adulation, but I loved it, thrusting my head over the high stable door whenever I heard them coming into the yard. Side by side, Topthorn and I would stand at the door to receive our unlimited ration of compliments and adoration, and of course this was sometimes accompanied by a welcome gift of perhaps a lump of sugar or an apple. But it was the evenings of that summer that stayed so strong in my memory. Often it would not be until dusk that we would clatter into the yard, and there, always waiting by the stable door, would be the little girl and her grandfather, who had come to us that first evening. The orderlies, so there are orderlies, the orderlies simply handed us over into their charge. So orderlies are people who obviously are in the hospital, but obviously we're at war in the book, and so they don't look like that. They're obviously dressed in sort of army kind of gear, and it's obviously not as beautiful and clean as a hospital. The orderlies simply handed us over into their charge, and that was just as well, for as kind as they were, they had no notion about horses. It was little Emily and her grandfather who insisted that they should look after us. They rubbed us down and saw to our sores and bruises. They fed us, watered us, and groomed us, and somehow always found enough straw for a dry, warm bed. Emily made us each a fringe to tie over our eyes to keep the flies from bothering us. There's the kind of fringe we're talking about. And in the warm summer evenings, she would lead us out to graze in the meadow below the farmhouse, and stayed with us, watching us grazing until her grandfather called us in again. She was a tiny, frail creature, but led us about the farm with complete confidence, chatting all the while about what she'd been doing all day and about how brave we were and how proud she was of us. As winter came on again and the grass lost its flavour and goodness, She would climb up into the loft above the stable and throw down our hay for us. And she would lie down on the loft floor looking at us through the trapdoor while we pulled the hay from the rack and ate it. Then, with her grandfather busying himself about us, she would prattle on merrily about how when she was older and stronger, and when the soldiers had all gone home and the war was over, she would ride us herself through the woods, one at a time, she said, and how we would never want for anything if only we would stay with her forever. Topthorn and I were by now seasoned campaigners, and it may well have been that drove us on out through the roar of the shell fire back towards the trenches each morning. But there was more to it than that. For us, it was the hope that we would be back that evening in our stable, and that little Emily would be there to comfort and to love us. We had that to look forward to and to long for. Any horse has an instinctive fondness for children, for they speak more softly, and their size precludes any threat. But Emily was a special child for us, for she spent every minute she could with us and lavished us with affection. She would be up late every evening with us, rubbing us down and seeing to our feet, and be up again at dawn to see us fed properly before the orderlies led us away and hitched us up to the ambulance cart. She would climb the wall by the pond and stand there waving, and although I could never turn around, I knew she would stay there until the road took us out of sight. And then she would be there when we came back in the evening, clasping her hands in excitement as she watched us being unhitched. But one evening at the onset of winter, she was not there to greet us as usual. We had been worked even harder that day than usual, for the first snows of winter had blocked the road up to the trenches to all but the horse-drawn vehicles, and we had to make twice the number of trips to bring in the wounded. Exhausted, hungry, and thirsty, we were led into our stable by Emily's grandfather, who said not a word but sought us quickly before hurrying back across the yard to the house. Topthorn and I spent that evening by the stable door, watching the gentle fall of snow and the flickering light in the farmhouse. We knew something was wrong, even before the old man came back and told us. He came late that night, his feet crumping the snow. He had made up the buckets of hot mash we had come to expect, and he sat down on the straw beneath the lantern and watched us eat. "She prays for you," he said, nodding slowly. "Do you know, every night before she goes to bed she prays for you? I've heard her. She prays for her dead father and mother. They were killed only a week after the war began. One shell, that's all it takes. And she prays for her brother that she'll never see again. Just 17, and he doesn't even have a grave. It's as if he never lived except in our minds. Then she prays for me, and for the war to pass by the farm and to leave us alone. And last of all, she prays for you two. She prays for two things. First, that you both survive the war and live on into ripe old age. And secondly, that if you do, she dearly wants to be there with you. She's barely 13, my Emily, and now she's lying up there in her room, and I don't know if she'll live to see the morning. The German doctor from the hospital tells me it's pneumonia. He's a good doctor enough, even if he's German. He's done his best. It's up to God now. And so far, God hasn't done too well for my family. If she goes, if my Emily dies, then the only light left in my life will be put out. He looked up at us through heavily wrinkled eyes and wiped the tears from his face. If you can understand anything of what I said, then pray for her to whatever horse god you pray to. Pray for her like she prays for you. As you can see on the screen, just a little bit of a picture of pneumonia. It's almost like when you start flu, and then sometimes flu develops into worse symptoms with a cough and a chest infection. And let me see where I found my place. I've lost it, guys. Oh, there we go. There was heavy shelling all that night, and before dawn the next day, the orderlies came for us and led us out into the snow to be hitched up. There was no sign of Emily nor her grandfather. Pulling the cart through the fresh, uncut snow that morning, Topthorn and I needed all our strength just to haul the empty cart up to the front line. The snow disguised perfectly the ruts and shell holes so that we found ourselves straining to extricate ourselves from the piled-up snow and the sinking mud beneath it. We made it to the front line, but only with the help of the 2 orderlies, who jumped out whenever we were in difficulties and turned the wheels over by hand until we were free again and the cart could gather momentum through the snow once more. The field dressing station behind the front line was crowded with wounded, and we had to bring back a heavier load than we had before, but fortunately the way back was mostly downhill. Someone suddenly remembered it was Christmas morning, and they sang slow, tuneful carols all the way back. For the most part they were casualties blinded by gas, and in their pain some of them cried, as they sang, for their lost sight. We made so many journeys that day, and stopped only when the hospital could take no more. It was already a starry night by the time we reached the farm. The shelling had stopped. There were no flares to light up the sky and blot out the stars. All away along the lane not a gun fired. Peace had come for one night, one at least. The snow in the yard was crisp by the frost. There was a dancing light in our stable, and Emily's grandfather came out into the snow and took our reins from the orderly. "It's a fine night," he said to us as he led us in. "It's a fine night, and all's well. There's mash and hay and water in there for you. I've given you extra tonight, not because it's cold, but because you prayed. You must have prayed to that horse guard of yours, because my Emily woke up at lunchtime. Sat up, she did, and do you know the first thing she said?" "I'll tell you. She said, 'I must get up. Got to get their mash ready for them when they come back. They'll be cold and tired,' she said." The only way that German doctor could get her to stay in bed was to promise you extra rations tonight, and she made him promise to go on with him as long as the cold weather lasted. So go inside, my beauties, and eat your fill. We've all had a Christmas present today, haven't we? All's well, I tell you. All's well. What a lovely chapter. We now move on to chapter 11. And all was to stay well for a time, at least, for the war suddenly moved away from us that spring. We knew it was not over for us, for we could still hear distant thunder of the guns, and the troops came marching through the farmyard from time to time upwards towards the line. But there were fewer wounded now to bring in, and we were needed less and less to pull our ambulance cart back and forth from the trenches. Topthorn and I would put out to grass in the meadow by the pond most days, but the evenings were still cold with the occasional frost, and our Emily would always come to us before dark. She did not need to lead us. She had but to call, and we followed. Emily was still weak from her illness, and coughed a great deal as she fussed around us in the stable. From time to time, she would heave herself up onto my back, and I would walk so gently around the yard and out into the meadow, with Topthorn following close behind. She used no reins on me, no saddle, no bits, no spurs, and sat astride me, not as my mistress, but rather as a friend. Topthorn was just that much taller and broader than me, and she found it very difficult to mount him, and even more difficult to get down. Sometimes she would use me as a stepping stone to Topthorn, but it was a difficult maneuver for her, and more than once she fell off in the attempt. But between Topthorn and me there was never any jealousy, and she was quite content to plod around beside us and take her on board whenever she felt like it. One evening we were out in the meadow sheltering under the chestnut tree from the heat of the new summer sun, when we heard the sound of an approaching convoy of lorries coming back from the front. So there we go, that's what a chestnut tree looks like. It gives quite a bit of shade, and this is a convoy when you've got a whole long line of trucks. In this case, it's lorries. As they came through the farm gate, they called out to us, and we recognized them as orderlies, nurses, and doctors from the field hospital. As the convoy stopped in the yard, we galloped over to the gate by the pond and looked over. Emily and her grandfather emerged from the milking shed and were deep in conversation with the doctor. Quite suddenly, we found ourselves besieged by all the orderlies we had come to know so well. They climbed the fence and patted and smoothed us with great affection. They were exuberant, yet somehow sad at the same time. Emily was running over towards us, shouting and screaming. I knew it would happen, she said. I knew it. I prayed for it to happen, and it did happen. They don't need you anymore to pull their carts. They're moving the hospital further up along the valley. There's a big battle going on up there, and so they're moving away from us. But they don't want to take you with them. That kind doctor has told Grandpapa that you can both stay. It's a kind of payment for the cart they used and the food they took, and because we looked after you throughout the winter. He says you can stay and work on the farm until the army needs you again. They never will, and if they ever did, I'd hide you. We'll never let them take you away, will we, Grandpapa? Never, never. And so after the long sad farewells, the convoy moved away up the road in a cloud of dust, and we were left alone and in peace with Emily and her grandfather. The peace was to prove sweet, but short-lived. To my great delight, I found myself once more a farm horse, with Topthorn harnessed up beside me as we set to work the very next day cutting and turning the hay. When Emily protested, after that first long day in the fields, that her grandfather was working us too hard, he put his hands on her shoulders and said, "Nonsense, Emily, they like to work. They need to work. And besides, the only way for us to go on living, Emily, is to go on like we did before. The soldiers have gone now, and so if we pretend hard enough, then maybe the war will go away altogether. We must live as we have always lived, cutting our hay, picking our apples, and tilling our soil. We cannot live as if there will be no tomorrow. We cannot live only if we eat, and our food comes from the land. We must work the land if we want to live, and these two must work it with us. They don't mind. They like the work. Look at them, Emily. Do they look unhappy?" Just pausing there quickly, guys. Just thinking about that in lockdown. I think some of us wonder if lockdown's ever going to end, and we do know it will. But whether we go back to our complete normal that we used to is another question. So don't sit around and not get into a routine. Make sure you've got that routine of waking up, perhaps walking between 6 and 9 with mom and dad, getting into your studies and working really hard, because we are going to get through this to a new normal. For Topthorn, the transition from pulling an ambulance cart to pulling a hay turner was not a difficult one, and he adapted easily. And for me, it was a dream I had dreamed many times since I'd left the farm in Denver. I was working once more with happy, laughing people around me who cared for me. We pulled with a will that harvest, Topthorn and I, hauling in the heavy hay wagons to the barns where Emily and her grandfather would unload. And Emily continued to watch over us lovingly. Every scratch and bruise was tended to at once, and her grandfather was never allowed to work us for too long, however much he argued. But the last return to the peaceful life of a farm horse could not last long, not in the middle of that war. The hay was almost all gathered in when the soldiers came back again one evening. We were in our stables when we heard the sound of approaching hoof beats and the rumbling of wheels on the cobbled stones as the column came trotting into the yard. The horses, 6 at a time, were yoked to great heavy guns, and they stood in their traces puffing and blowing with exertion. Each pair was ridden by men whose faces were severe and hard under their grey caps. I noticed at once that these were not the gentle orderlies that had left us only a few short weeks before. Their faces were strange and harsh, and there was a new alarm and urgency in their eyes. Few of them seemed to laugh or even smile. These were a different breed of men from those we had seen before. Only one soldier who drove the ammunition cart came over to us to stroke us and spoke kindly to little Emily. So there's your ammunition cart. After a brief consultation with Emily's grandfather, the artillery troop bivouacked in our meadow that night, watering the horses in our pond. Remember that means just to camp out or to tent out. This is an artillery troop, so they've got really big machines and guns and war devices to use. Topthorn and I were excited by the arrival of new horses and spent all evening with our heads over the stable door neighing to them, but most of them seemed too tired to reply. Emily came to tell us about the soldiers that evening, and we could see she was worried, for she would talk only a whisper. "Grandpapa doesn't like them here," she said. He doesn't trust the officer, says he's got eyes like a wasp, and you can't trust a wasp. But they'll be gone in the morning, and then we'll be on our own again. Early that next morning, as the dark of night left the sky, a visitor came to our stables. It was a pale, thin man in dusty uniform who peered over the door to inspect us. He had eyes that stood out of his face in a permanent stare, and he wore a pair of wide-framed spectacles through which he watched us intently, nodding as he did so. He stood a few minutes and then left. By full light, the artillery troop was drawn up in the yard and ready to move. There was a loud and incessant knocking on the farm door, and we saw Emily and her grandfather come out into the yard, still dressed in their night clothes. "Your horses, monsieur," the bespectacled officer announced boldly. "I shall be taking your horses with us. I have one team with only 4 horses, and I need 2 more. They look fine, strong animals, and they will learn quickly. We will be taking them with us." "But how can I work my farm without horses?" Emily's grandfather said. "They are just farm horses. They won't be able to pull guns." "Sir," said the officer, "there is a war on, and I have to have horses for my guns. I have to take them. What you do on your farm is your own business, but I must have the horses. The army needs them." "But you can't," Emily cried. "They're my horses. You can't take them. Don't let them, Grandpapa. Don't let them. Please don't let them." The old man shrugged his shoulders sadly. "My child," he said quietly, "what can I do? How could I stop them? Do you suggest I cut them to pieces with my lathe, or lay about them with my axe? No, my child. We knew it might happen one day, didn't we? We talked about it often enough, didn't we? We knew they would go one day. Now I want no tears in front of these people. You're to be proud and strong like your brother was, and I'll not have you weaken in front of them. Go and say your goodbyes to the horses, Emily, and be brave." Little Emily led us to the back of the stable and slipped our halters on, carefully arranging our manes so that they were not snagged by the rope. Then she reached up and put her arms around us, leaning her head into each of us in turn and crying softly. "Come back," she said. "Please come back to me. I shall die if you don't come back." She wiped her eyes and pushed back her hair before opening the stable door and leading us out into the yard. She walked us directly towards the officer and handed over the reins. "I want them back," she said, her voice strong now, almost fierce. "I'm just lending them to you. They are my horses. They belong here. Feed them well and look after them and make sure you bring them back." And she walked past her grandfather and into the house without even turning around. As we left the farm, hauled unwillingly along behind the ammunition cart, I turned and saw Emily's grandfather, still standing in the yard. He was smiling and waving at us through his tears. Then the rope jerked my head violently around and jolted me into a trot, and I recalled the time once before when I had been roped up to a cart and dragged away against my will. But at least this time I had my top thorn with me. How special. Now gotten to chapter 12, and this is where we'll end today. Perhaps it was the contrast with the few idyllic months we had spent with Emily and her grandfather that made what followed so harsh and so bitter an experience for Topthorn and me. Or perhaps it was just that the war was all the time becoming more terrible. In places now, the guns were lined up only a few yards apart for miles and miles, and when they sounded out their fury, the very earth shook beneath us. The lines of wounded seemed interminable now, and the countryside was laid waste for miles behind the trenches. The work itself was certainly no harder than when we had been pulling the ambulance cart, but now we were no longer stabled every night, and of course we no longer had the protection of our Emily to rely on. Suddenly the war was no longer distant. We were back amongst the fearful noise and the stench of battle, hauling our gun through the mud, urged on and sometimes whipped on by men who displayed little care or interest in our welfare, just so long as we got the guns where they had to go. It was not that they were cruel men, but just that they seemed to be driven now by a fearful compulsion that left no room and no time for pleasantness or consideration either for each other or for us. Food was scarcer now. We received our corn ration only sporadically as winter came on again, and there was only a meagre hay ration for each of us. One by one, we began to lose weight and condition. At the same time, the battle seemed to become more furious and prolonged, and we worked longer and harder hours, pulling in front of the gun. We were permanently sore and permanently cold. We ended every day covered in a layer of cold, dripping mud that seemed to seep through and chill us to the bone. The gun team was a motley collection of 6 horses. Of the 4 we joined, only one had the height and the strength to pull as a gun should. Sorry guys, I'm going to read that again. Of the 4 we joined, only one had the height and the strength to pull as a gun horse should, a great hulk of a horse they called Henny, who seemed quite unperturbed by all that was going on around him. The rest of the team tried to live up to his example, but only Topthorn succeeded. Henny and Topthorn were the leading pair, and I found myself in the traces behind Topthorn next to a thin, wiry little horse they called Coco. He had a display of white patch marks over his face that often caused amusement among the soldiers as we passed by. But there was nothing funny about Coco. He had the nastiest temper of any horse I've ever met, either before or since. When Coco was eating, no one, neither horse nor man, ventured within biting or kicking distance. Behind us was a perfectly matched pair of small, dun-coloured ponies with flaxen manes and tails. No one could tell them apart. Even the soldiers referred to them not by name, but merely as the 2 golden halflingers. And just so you know, there's a picture of a halflinger. I seem to be in the way, so I'm going to move myself slightly out the way. Beautiful colouring and that mane. Because they were pretty and invariably friendly, they received much attention and even a little affection from the gunners. They must have been a sight, but to the Thai soldiers, they loved to see them. There was no doubt that they worked as hard as the rest of us, and that in spite of their diminutive size, they were at least our equals in stamina. But in the canter, they acted as a brake, slowed us down, and spoiled the rhythm of the team. Strangely enough, it was the giant Henny who showed the first signs of weakness. The cold, sinking mud and the lack of proper fodder through that appalling winter began to shrink his massive frame and reduced him within months to a poor, skinny-looking creature. So to my delight, and I must confess it, they moved me up into the leading pair with Topthorn, and Henny dropped back now to pull alongside little Coco, who had begun their ordeal with little strength in reserve. They both went rapidly downhill until the 2 of them were only any use for pulling on flat, hard surfaces, and since we scarcely ever travelled over such ground, they were soon of little use in the team, and made the work for the rest of us that much more arduous. Each night we spent in the lines up to our hocks in freezing mud, in conditions far worse than that first winter of war when Topthorn and I had been cavalry horses. Then each horse had a trooper who did all he could to care for us and comfort us, but now the efficiency of the gun was the first priority, and we came a very poor second. We were mere workhorses and treated as such. The gunners themselves were grey in the face with exhaustion and hunger. Survival was all that mattered to them now. Only the kind old gunner I had noticed that first day when we were taken from the farm seemed to have the time to stay with us. He fed us with hard bits of crumbly black bread and spent more time with us than with his fellow soldiers, whom he seemed to avoid all he could. He was an untidy, portly little man who chuckled incessantly and would talk more to himself than to anyone else. The effects of continual exposure, underfeeding, and hard work were now apparent in all of us. Few of us had any hair growing on our lower legs, and the skin below was a mass of cracked sores. Even the rugged little halflingers began to lose condition. Like all the others, I found every step I took now excruciatingly painful, particularly in my forelegs, which were cracking badly from the knees downwards, and there was not a horse in the team that was not walking lame. The vets treated us as best they could, and even the most hard-hearted of the gunners seemed disturbed as our condition worsened. There was nothing anyone could do until the mud disappeared. The field vets shook their heads in despair and pulled back those that they could for rest and recuperation, but some had deteriorated so much that they were led away and shot there and then shot there and then after the vet's inspection. Henny went that way one morning, and we passed him lying in the mud, a collapsed wreck of a horse. And so eventually did Coco, who was hit in his neck by flying shrapnel and had to be destroyed where he lay by the side of the road. No matter how much I disliked him, and he was a vicious beast, it was a piteous and terrible sight to see a fellow creature with whom I had pulled for so long, discarded and forgotten, in a ditch. Little halflingers stayed with us through the winter, straining their broad backs and pulling against the traces with all the strength they could muster. They were both gentle and kind, with not a shred of aggression in their courageous souls, and Topthorn and I came to love them dearly. In their turn, they looked up to us for support and friendship, and we gave both willingly. I first noticed that Topthorn was failing when I felt the gun pulling more heavily than before. We were fording a small stream when the wheels of the gun became stuck in the mud. I turned quickly to look at him and saw him suddenly labouring and low in his stride. His eyes told me the pain he was suffering, and I pulled all the harder to enable him to ease up. That night, with the rain sheeting down relentlessly on our backs, I stood over him as he lay down in the mud. He lay not on his stomach, as he always did, but stretched out on his side, lifting his head from time to time as spasms of coughing shook him. He coughed intermittently all night and slept only fitfully. I worried over him, nuzzling him and licking him to try to keep him warm and to reassure him that he was not alone. I consoled him with the thought that no horse I had ever seen had the power and stamina of Topthorn, and that he must have a reserve of great strength to fall back on in his sickness. And sure enough, he was up on his feet the next morning before the gunners came to feed us our ration of corn. And although his head hung lower than usual and he moved only ponderously, I could see that he had the strength to survive, if only he could rest. I noticed, however, that when the vet came that day checking along the lines, he looked long and hard at Topthorn and listened carefully to his chest. "He's a strong one," I heard him tell the speckled officer, a man whom I no longer liked. Neither horses nor men liked him. "There's fine breeding here, too fine perhaps, Herr Major. This could well be his undoing. He's too fine to pull a gun. I'd put him out. But you have no horse to take his place, have you?" "He'll go on, I suppose, but go easy on him, Herr Major. Take the team as slow as you can, else you'll have no team. And without your team, your gun won't be a lot of use, will it?" "He will have to do what the others do, Herr Doctor," said the Major in a steely voice. "No more and no less. I cannot make exceptions. If you pass him fit, he's fit, and that's that." "He's fit to go on," said the vet reluctantly, "but I'm warning you, Herr Major, you must take care." "We do what we can," said the Major dismissively. And to be fair, they did. It was the mud that was killing us one by one. The mud, the lack of shelter, and the lack of food. And so we've come to the end of chapter 12. So we will start our next reading at chapter 13. And so nothing more from me, grade 7s, just to thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it this morning. And just remember that you can email me at grade7@worksheetcloud.com, and then there will be an activity for you at the end of this video. So thanks again. Have a wonderful, wonderful morning, and I will see you same time, same place. Bye, guys.